The Federal National Party has confirmed it will oppose Labor's Indigenous voice to Parliament. After consulting with regional communities, leader David Littleproud says they don't believe it will close the gap for the voters they represent. But Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young says it shows the Nationals are out of touch with everyday Australians.
They're on the wrong side of history on this. This decision by the Nationals is a disgrace. After over 200 years of First Nations people being silenced in this country, the National Party want that to continue.
And the leader of the National Party, David Littleproud, joins us now. David, the Voice to Parliament is designed to give Indigenous people a greater say on the issues that affect them. Why would you object to that?
Unfortunately, we think this will add another layer of bureaucracy, particularly for those Indigenous Australians that live in regional, rural and remote Australia. While this may advance the cause for those in Redfern, for those that live in Wilcannia or Central Australia, Wilcannia and Carnarvon, this will actually mean there's another layer for them to hear their voice being heard.
But your argument seems to be that the Voice will exclude rural Indigenous people. On what basis? Surely that depends on how the Voice is constituted, how it operates, and these are all things that you can make a contribution to.
Yeah, and much of the challenge that we've gone through the consultation with both the yes and no is that obviously there's very limited detail, but the detail that they have openly shared is that unfortunately you are talking about very diverse communities that need unique voices, and that won't be able to be provided in the design of this. And in fact, what you're asking us to do and what you're saying in changing your constitution and what the government is asking us to do is to trust the Parliament, to trust the politicians to get the settings on this right. This should be about empowering the local communities at a local level. And that is going to be different in each of these rural and remote. And I get that city people might say, why would we look at this and say this isn't a good idea? Until you've walked a mile in some of these communities and represented some of these communities. And in fact, in Jacinta Price's example, she's actually lived the cases of domestic violence in her own life. That the solutions can't be found in Canberra.
But to pick up the point you're making, it sounds like you have the idea of the Voice, the proposal of the Voice backwards, at least as far as it wants to present itself. You're saying the solution isn't in Canberra. That's partly the whole point of the Voice, is that Canberra hasn't been engaging, and so there needs to be a mechanism to bring it to Canberra. Without that mechanism, aren't you basically just saying, well, sorry, but you're going to have to rely on Canberra to do something that it has never really done in its entire history when it comes to Indigenous affairs?
No, but sadly, you're going to be sending very few from these communities to Canberra.
But at the moment, there's no one, right? And the track record is obvious.
With respect, there's 11 Indigenous Australians that have been elected to this Parliament proudly have been elected to this Parliament. So there is that voice that is here. But this is
that's
about...
unprecedented, though, and I'm talking about the track record that Canberra has.
I'll answer the question.
It's important. Why the idea of the Voice.
I understand your point. Sure. I understand your point. I'll answer the question. Unfortunately, what will happen with the Voice is that there will be very few. It'll be a very narrow cohort, and that is actually one of the challenges of the design of trying to create this. Is there'll be a very narrow cohort that will come from these remote places to try and have their voice heard. When in fact we as a nation and as a government should flip this around, in that they shouldn't have to come to Canberra. You, in fact, can create these mechanisms in local communities. There's over 1,100 organisations that have been created and programs around trying to change Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island disadvantage. But it has to be at a local level, and this should be flipped around, that the voice should be created at a local level, not through the Constitution, and that should have the agility of the government and not locking in future generations into a mechanism that you can only change with a future referendum.
David, as long as I've been alive, we've been trying to fix this problem. And what you're now saying is we're no closer. You've been in governments for years where we were trying to fix that problem. No one ever fixes it. This is the problem. You've got people out there abusing drugs, you've got domestic violence. It shouldn't be happening. But what's your solution? You're saying go out and fix it in the local community. We've tried that and it hasn't worked.
No, with respect, Steve, there has been progress, and
Where?
while it hasn't been, well, I'm about to answer that. And with respect to the speed of it, I agree. It hasn't been as quick as it should, but we've actually had a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander procurement program that's put $5.3 billion into Indigenous businesses by changing the policy, creating 10,000 jobs. We had a policy around the cashless debit card that this government took away. And sadly, that was the wrong decision, because what that's done is pumped hundreds of thousands of dollars into some of these communities. into the hands of people who are perpetrators. And while the government says that we took away their dignity by putting in the cashless debit card to actually control some of their welfare spend on food and the essentials for their families, what's happened is we've forgotten about the dignity of those women and children in some of these communities. One of the most harrowing stories I've heard is around a 24-year-old woman who's now a grandmother in one of these Indigenous communities. So this is while there are many challenges, we have made progress, and we should even look at novel ideas and constructive ideas that are not just on cashless debit card, but if you want to make sure that MPs like myself and right across the political spectrum, why don't we have an Indigenous liaison officer in our electorate offices that are there to solely focus on Indigenous issues at a local level to make sure that their voice in Parliament, me as their elected representative, brings it forward. These are the constructive ideas that the National wants to shift the dial on this.
You're using the word constructive. I mean, what you're saying today, where you weren't supportive, and I presume you've spoken to your coalition partners and they're going to make their own decision, but isn't this destructive? It's not constructive, because this basically blows it up, doesn't it?
No, with respect. I think this should be a national conversation held with respect. And divergent views shouldn't be disrespected. Now, I've given Peter Dutton the respect to talk to him before we made any public statement, that understood that we look at this uniquely through a different lens of probably what they are, because we represent those regional, rural and remote Australians. And that's all we're saying to all Australians. This should be an open conversation, but please understand that we have respectfully looked through this and consulted as widely as possible to make sure that we get the balance right and to get to in our decision-making process.
David, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.